In the archives of the British Museum, in a wing most visitors walk past without stopping, there are reliefs carved from gypsum panels that once lined the walls of a palace in northern Iraq. The palace belonged to Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria. The reliefs are famous: lions dying under arrows, prisoners impaled on stakes, cities burning while their inhabitants are marched away in chains. For nearly 2 centuries, scholars have read these panels the way they were meant to be read, as propaganda, as the boasting of a king, as art commissioned to terrify. They are not only that. Recent excavations at Nimrud, Nineveh, and Tel Barsip, combined with the ongoing decipherment of state administrative tablets recovered from the Assyrian heartland, have delivered a finding that reframes the entire Neo-Assyrian military system. The cruelty was not decoration, it was infrastructure. The impalements, the deportations, the deliberate flaying of governors on city walls were not the excesses of individual kings. They were a designed instrument of state, budgeted, scheduled, and audited by a bureaucracy that recorded its work in cuneiform on clay. The existing story cannot survive this. Assyria has been read for 150 years as a militaristic culture that indulged in cruelty. It is now being read as a culture that industrialized cruelty and turned it into a functioning economic engine. The difference matters. This is what the tablets, the reliefs, and the mass graves are now saying together. The entry point is a young British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard, who in 1845 began digging into a mound in northern Iraq called Nimrud. He was 28 years old. He was not strictly speaking an archaeologist. He was a lawyer who had abandoned his career to travel. He expected to find something. He did not expect to find a palace. He found a palace. He found several. He found rooms whose walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with carved stone panels depicting scenes of Assyrian kings at war. He shipped them by raft down the Tigris and eventually to London. For the next century and a half, those panels defined how the modern world understood the Assyrian Empire. The working assumption was simple. The reliefs were royal propaganda, exaggerated for effect. The impalements, the flayings, the piles of severed heads were symbolic. Real ancient armies did not operate this way. No functioning state could. It was the reasonable assumption. It was wrong. The reason it was wrong is that scholars were reading only the pictures. They were not yet reading, in any systematic way, the state's own administrative correspondence. Tens of thousands of clay tablets recovered from Nineveh, Kalhu, and Dur-Shurukin sat in museum drawers for decades before Assyriologists worked through them line by line. What those tablets contain is not propaganda. It is paperwork. Field reports from governors, supply requisitions, deportation logs, interrogation records, letters from provincial officials asking the king what to do about specific rebellions in specific towns. The paperwork matches the reliefs. Everything the palace walls depicted, the state archives recorded as policy. Before going further, the objection has to be addressed, because it is the objection any serious reader will raise. How do we know these tablets are not themselves propaganda? How do we know the administrative record is not just as performative as the carved wall? The answer lies in the nature of the documents. Royal inscriptions boast. Administrative tablets do not. The letters recovered from the state archive are internal, mundane, and frequently embarrassing to the crown. Governors complain about shortages. Officials request clarification on orders. Scribes record failures, delays, and desertions. A propaganda archive does not contain a letter from a border official reporting that a scheduled deportation cannot proceed because the wagons have not arrived. A propaganda archive does not preserve the memo about the wagons. The Assyrian archive does. That is why it is trusted. It is trusted because it is boring. And it is inside the boring parts that the machine becomes visible. The first thing that becomes clear, once the tablets are read alongside the reliefs, is the scale. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, at its height under Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, was the largest political entity the ancient Near East had ever produced. It stretched from western Iran to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of northern Arabia. Governing it required a standing professional army, permanent provincial administration, and a road system with relay stations for royal messengers. None of that existed on this scale before Assyria built it. 700 years before the birth of Christ, 200 years before Persia, 400 years before Rome, existed as anything more than a village on a hill. The empire ran on a single principle, and the tablets state it plainly. Rebellion was to be met with force so extreme, so publicly documented, and so consistently applied that the calculation to rebel would never again be worth making. This was not rage, it was arithmetic. The instrument of this arithmetic was the practice known in modern scholarship as calculated frightfulness. The Assyrians themselves did not use that phrase. They used something colder. In their royal inscriptions, kings describe with precision what was done to the population of a city that resisted: impalement of the ruling class on stakes outside the walls, flaying of the governor, his skin nailed to the gate, deportation of the surviving population to a distant province, replaced by deportees from somewhere else. The city itself renamed, resettled, and reassigned to a new provincial governor answering directly to the king. Every one of these actions is recorded, not once, repeatedly, across reigns, across regions, across nearly 3 centuries. Why does the evidence exist at all? Why are we able to read the private paperwork of a state that fell in 612 BC? The answer is fire. When the coalition of Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh, they burned the palace complexes to the ground. The heat baked the clay tablets stored in the archives into something close to ceramic. What would have decayed in any other medium was preserved by the same catastrophe that ended the empire. The Assyrian state was destroyed. Its filing cabinets were not. They were fired, buried, and waited 2,500 years to be read. Nobody preserved this record on purpose. The empire's enemies preserved it by accident, and the accident is the only reason the machine can now be reconstructed. And once it is reconstructed, the escalation begins. The first false assumption to fall is that the deportations were disorganized. Popular imagination has long pictured the Assyrian deportations as chaotic mass expulsions, columns of the miserable driven into exile at spear point. The reliefs show something like this. The tablets show something else. The deportations were logistical operations. State scribes recorded the numbers of deportees by household. Provincial officials received advance notice of incoming populations and were required to have housing, seed grain, and agricultural tools ready. Deportees were resettled as productive units, not scattered as refugees. They were given land. They were expected to farm it, pay taxes on it, and provide conscripts from it. The Assyrian state moved, over the course of 3 centuries, an estimated 4.5 million people. It moved them the way a modern state moves freight. This was not cruelty as impulse. It was cruelty as demography. Populations were rearranged so that no ethnic group remained large enough or geographically concentrated enough to rebel effectively. Aramaeans were sent to the Zagros. Israelites were sent to Media. Chaldeans were sent to the north. The empire's provinces became demographic patchworks in which no local identity could reconstitute itself as a political force. The reliefs show the columns of deportees. The tablets show the receipts. The second assumption to fall is that the army was seasonal. Ancient armies, as a rule, were levies. Farmers were called up in spring, fought through summer, and returned in autumn to bring in the harvest. This constrained what any pre-modern state could do. Assyria dissolved that constraint. Beginning under Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BC, the empire built the first documented standing professional army in the ancient Near East. The Assyriologists have the muster rolls. They have the ration lists. They have the letters from officers complaining about specific soldiers by name. The army was fed by state granaries, equipped by state arsenals, and paid in rations and land grants. It included specialist units, cavalry, chariotry, engineers, siege corps, sappers, and a corps of scribes whose job was to record everything the army did. The scribes are the key. The Assyrian army did not simply conquer, it documented conquest in real time on tablets carried in the baggage train, the number of prisoners taken, the weight of tribute extracted, the names of the rebel leaders executed. This information traveled back to the capital, where it was checked, filed, and used to update provincial tax rolls before the campaign was even over. An empire whose armies filed quarterly reports. The third assumption to fall concerns the reliefs themselves. For most of the 20th century, the standard reading was that the scenes of atrocity on the palace walls were symbolic exaggeration. Nobody, it was assumed, would actually flay a governor and nail his skin to a gate. The image was understood as metaphor. It was not metaphor. Excavations at Tilbar Seep and at the outer walls of several provincial capitals have recovered skeletal remains bearing perimortem cut marks consistent with the practices depicted. Isotopic analysis of some of these remains indicates individuals who did not grow up locally, matching the profile of a captured foreign governor or official. The reliefs were not exaggerating. They were reporting. The palace walls were, in a real and literal sense, the empire's public record, at which point the viewer has to stop and ask the harder question: what kind of society produced this? The answer is where the entire framing has to change. The people running this empire were not primitive. They were not, in any meaningful sense, less intelligent, less rational, or less capable of moral reflection than the modern reader. Human beings have not changed neurologically in more than 100,000 years. The scribes filing the deportation reports were operating the same cognitive machinery as the analysts in a modern government ministry. The engineers designing the siege ramps at Lachish were solving problems the same way modern engineers do. The kings ordering the flayings were not savages who did not know what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. That is the point. The Assyrian court produced medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, and the first known library systematically assembled by a head of state. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh contained tens of thousands of tablets covering every field of knowledge then available. The king himself could read and write cuneiform, which was unusual for a monarch. The same king ordered the mutilations depicted on his palace walls. Both facts belong to the same man and the same system. The sophistication and the cruelty were not opposing forces. They were the same institution. This is the point at which the older interpretation collapses entirely. Assyria was not a barbaric state that happened to have bureaucracy. It was a bureaucratic state that had industrialized terror as an instrument of governance. The scribes did not soften the violence. They organized it, scheduled it, and made it repeatable. And there is a further dimension, which the tablets reveal only when read collectively. The terror was calibrated. The Assyrian state did not treat all rebellions identically. Cities that surrendered on first summons were taxed but not destroyed. Cities that resisted and then surrendered lost their ruling class but kept their population. Cities that fought to the end and had to be taken by siege were annihilated, their leadership publicly executed in specific documented ways, their population deported, their names sometimes literally struck from the record. The gradient was published. It was known throughout the empire and beyond it. When an Assyrian army appeared at the walls of a city, the local ruler knew precisely what each of his options cost. The system worked because the price list was public. This is the industrialization, not the violence itself, which many ancient states practiced. The publication of the violence, the consistency of the violence, the bureaucratic reliability of the violence. An enemy king in Damascus or Tyre or Jerusalem could predict with actuarial certainty what would happen to him and to his city under each possible course of action. That predictability was the empire's most valuable weapon. It made most conquests unnecessary. Cities surrendered because the mathematics of resistance had already been done for them. At the excavation of Lachish, in what is now southern Israel, the physical residue of one such calculation still lies in the ground. Lachish was a fortified city of the Kingdom of Judah. In 701 BC, it was besieged by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The siege is depicted on a series of reliefs that once lined a room in Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. The reliefs show the siege ramp, the archers, the battering rams, the fall of the city, and the impalement of its defenders. They also show columns of deportees leaving under guard. British excavations at the site, resumed and refined by subsequent Israeli teams, have found the siege ramp. They have found Assyrian arrowheads embedded in the collapsed walls. They have found the mass grave of the defenders. The forensic evidence matches the reliefs down to the details of weapon types and body positions. Sennacherib's palace was showing his court what he had done. The archaeological ground is showing modern researchers that he was not exaggerating, which brings the record to the harder ground. Inside the same administrative archive that documents the road stations and the ration lists, there are letters that describe, in unadorned prose, the treatment of specific individuals. A rebel leader from the Chaldean south is described as having been brought to Nineveh, paraded, and executed by a method the tablet names precisely. The tablet is not a boast. It is a report from an official confirming that the order was carried out and requesting instructions on the disposal of the remains. It is procedural. That is what makes it unbearable. At Nimrud, in the wells beneath the Northwest Palace, excavators recovered the remains of women and children who had been thrown down the shafts, apparently during the sack of the city by the Medes and Babylonians in the 7th century BC. They were, in all likelihood, the last royal household of the empire that had spent 3 centuries teaching the region what happened to defeated capitals. When Nineveh and Nimrud fell, the practices Assyria had industrialized were turned back on Assyria. The system did not die because someone rejected it. It died because someone else applied it, and applied it thoroughly. Inside a state that produced the first great library of the ancient Near East, that mapped the stars and cataloged diseases, the same administration ran a schedule of mutilations and deportations that reshaped the demography of an entire region. The scribes who copied the astronomical tables also filed the deportation manifests. The engineers who designed the aqueduct at Jerwan also designed the siege ramps at Lachish. The knowledge and the cruelty were produced by the same hands, in the same rooms, under the same seal. Neither fact cancels the other, and the temptation to make one of them the true Assyria has to be resisted. The empire was what its own paperwork shows it to have been, in full, without reconciliation. And Davai. When the reliefs, the tablets, the mass graves, and the isotopic evidence are placed side by side, they do not describe a state that lost control of its violence. They describe a state that had solved a specific problem, which was the problem of governing an enormous, ethnically diverse, agriculturally rich, and politically fractious region, with the transportation and communication technology available in the 8th century BC. The solution was calibrated, published, bureaucratic terror. Each of these findings alone would revise the picture. Together, they are not findings. They are a portrait. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was the first state to treat organized cruelty as a governance technology, to standardize it, to document it, and to deploy it with the same seriousness a modern state deploys tax policy. It was not the first empire to be violent. It was the first empire to be violent as a system. What the recent decipherment has opened, and not closed, is the question of what happened inside the population that lived under this arrangement for 3 centuries. The tablets record the state's view. They do not record what the ordinary farmer in a resettled village in the Zagros thought about the empire that had brought him there. Some of that story may still be recoverable from village-level archaeology, from linguistic evidence in the Aramaic that gradually replaced Akkadian, and from the biblical and Babylonian sources that describe Assyria from the outside. Much of it will not be. The state archived itself in extraordinary detail. The people it moved did not. The work is not finished. Tablets from the Nineveh archives remain untranslated. Provincial administrative centers in what is now Syria and Iraq have been damaged by recent conflict, and some sites have been looted before they could be excavated. What the record shows so far is the shape of the machine. What it does not yet show is everything the machine did. The individuals do not have names in most cases. The deportees are numbers on tablets. The impaled governors are titles without personal identity. The women in the wells at Nimrud were not identified before they were buried, and they have not been identified since. They are counted. They are not remembered. They did not know their deaths would be reconstructed 2,700 years later from the same paperwork that ordered them. They did not know the empire that moved them would fall within a lifetime of some of them arriving in their new provinces. They did not know that the clay tablets recording their transport would outlast every wooden building, every city wall, and every royal name they had been taught to fear. They were not primitive people ruled by primitive rulers. They were the same species running the same minds inside a system that had learned how to use those minds against them. What the Assyrian archive finally shows, once it is read as a whole, is not an ancient horror. It is the first working model of something the modern world has seen since. In other languages, under other seals, with other paperwork, and always with the same terrible efficiency. Don't miss the next video either. It's just as fascinating, and it's waiting for you right now.